Good morning. Welcome back. This is part two of a two-part mini-series on my most challenging project yet. It's primarily for folks like me that are new to lasers or beginners in Lightburn as well as with the Bolt. If you haven't seen the other video or the part one video, I'll put a link to it here. It might be helpful if you even just skim through that first before you continue with this video so you have some context. Today on Laser Nug. So a few things before we begin. We're largely going to be spending our time today in Lightburn. If you're like me, especially when you're new to something or you're trying to learn software or other new things, you kind of tend to take it in pieces because I can only remember so many things at once. So I think for the last month or two, as I've been working with different materials, I've been resting on my laurels a little bit, so to speak. Learned a number of different, at least basic features in Lightburn and was able to utilize those to do projects or products for folks. Until my buddy gave me this logo. It's his new refreshed logo. And when I tried to put that into Lightburn, I was faced with a lot of things I hadn't seen before. And it caused me to take some time out, get back into Lightburn tutorials, other tutorials I found on YouTube, which I'll give you references to today, which it helped me greatly and allowed me to finish this product. However, I still made 4 major mistakes. And I'm also going to include today what those mistakes were and the things I could have done differently in Lightburn to minimize or eliminate those mistakes. So if you've got a coffee or a cup of tea, let's get to it. Okay, so let's get back into Lightburn, and I'm going to walk you through some of the main parts. I'm not going to take you through the whole build, but I'm going to focus on things like the trace function, things that I could have used, the weld function, some of the features in Lightburn that I didn't really recognize or understand before. And again, this video or this follow-up, part 2, is for folks like myself that may not have gotten this far in their tutorials. And hey, if you are much more experienced and you have the time to hang out with us, great to see any additional tips or tricks or information in the comments if you have the time to do so. Let me grab the logo. And I just want to point out a few things. Notwithstanding the black background, this was the logo that was provided to me by my buddy. It's 7 different colors, and as you can see, there are multiple layers. There's black, gray, orange. There are 2 shades of blue. This Easton Made Letters is 1 shade. The Wood Splitters is a different shade. You'll also see that there's, I guess, what you might call shading around each one. So you've got white shading here. The Easton Made sign itself is in a gradient black. First time I've dealt with gradients, and you're going to see what happens when we try to trace this. And you'll see that in the inside of the letters like the A, the O, the D, there's a fill in there. And when you've got a small logo, these look really, really tiny. In fact, if you take a look specifically in the word splitters, you'll see inside the P and the R, when this is smaller, those are so tiny, they look like mistakes that I deleted out of the logo. I'm not sure how much experience you've had tracing things yet, but a lot of graphic designs that come to me in JPEG or PNG format, once I've traced them, there's a lot of what I'd call errant little tiny dots or shapes that are really tiny somewhere in the logo that gets picked up in the trace, and I just delete them, which is exactly what I did here. But I'm going to show you today what I could have done to avoid that. Because it's a PNG file, I can't open it. I need to use the import button. I have it into Lightburn. This is what you're going to see. Before we go further into the trace function, if you come up to your cuts and layers, it automatically created an image file for it. So I just want you to stick a pin on that. Also, before we go further, on each one of your layers, you'll probably recognize there's an output, a show, air, etc. If you click on the show and you turn it off, it disappears, right? The important thing is it does not delete it out of your file. It just takes it out of your view, especially when you start to get busy on your workspace. If I want to see it again, I click show and it comes back. That works similarly for all the layers that you create on any type of design. So we're going to leave it in here. I'm going to highlight it and we're going to trace this. I'm going to go to my tools. I'm going to come down and I'm going to trace image. This is what I saw. If you look closely, you'll notice that it's traced most of it, but it hasn't traced all of it. The second thing, which was the first time I was faced with, is if I blow this up, look at what happens to the trace function in the bottom of the letters. I'm just going to come down to the bottom and fade the image so you can see it clearer. Look at what happened to all my letters. This is due to the gradient image of that black shading in the color. So my letters are not clean and they're not crisp. So on this initial pass at its default threshold of 128 and a cutoff of 0, as you can see down here, I'm seeing most of it, but I'm missing lines around the letters as well as what is the gray layer is missing. Let's click OK at this point and we'll come back to this. So here's what I got out of the trace function. Just for clarity, I'm going to take my image off the screen and we're going to focus just on the trace. Let me zoom it in, and just for comparison I want to put a shot of the actual logo here. You'll notice that I'm missing one of the lines around the letters, or one of the layers, and I'm also missing this gray layer here that's in between the black and the orange is missing. And on top of that, as you can see, all my letters are skewed because of the gradient imaging. So assuming that I have to work with this trace, I need a way to make these letters square again. I need to get rid of these angled cuts here at the bottom. And this is where I realized I needed to take some time and learn at least a little bit about what nodes are. I'm going to grab the image, I'm going to come up here to the top and I'm going to ungroup it, and I'm going to grab letters individually. Let me zoom in on the N, for example. I need to get this square at the bottom on the N. So I'm going to come over here to the left side toolbar and I'm going to click on my nodes. And you'll see, by the way, if you hold your cursor over any item in Lightburn and you leave it there long enough, you'll get a little menu that helps you out with what that function is, or in this case, what some of the shortcuts are for doing different things to nodes or lines or curves that have nodes on them. So I'm going to grab different parts of this and see what I can do to try to fix it. And this was difficult for me by all means. So as you can see here, I'm just going to come up and select, I fixed my N. So assuming that I wasn't able to trace this any better, I would need to use nodes in order to fix all of these letters. But keep in mind, I still have a lot of missing components or layers out of this logo. And given the fact that I'm just learning nodes, as you are, I did find what I think is one of the best, if not the best, video tutorial on YouTube that will explain everything you need to know about nodes, how to edit them, how to use them. And I'm going to put a link to that YouTube video down in the description of this video for you folks to watch. So one of the key mistakes I made is I didn't really fully understand or have a good appreciation for how to use the trace function. About 2 months ago, one of you kind folks left me a comment and said, hey, by the way, you know you can trace something more than once. So I went back in and I tried to do the trace function. And in fact, you can use it as many times as you want. Let's take a look. First of all, let's highlight our first trace and let's just delete that out of there. I'm going to come back up here to the right. You'll notice I still have the image file. I hid it though from the screen, so we'll put it back up. I'm going to highlight it and let's go back into trace. I'm going to trace image. Let's open this up. Before I go further, I'm going to put the link to a video from YouTube that I, again, think is one of the best, if not the best video I found so far that explains how cutoff and threshold actually work and how they complement each other, as well as what happens when you use the ignore less than, the smoothness, what optimize does, and pretty much everything you need to know about tracing an image. And he also demonstrates it so that you can see how threshold and cutoff complement each other. So if you'll recall, this was my first trace, and if I fade the image here, you'll see my letters are all skewed. But watch what happens when I start to drop the threshold. Try to take a look at everything, because right now we're getting a lot of things, but we're missing a number of components that haven't traced. But the first thing I'm going to do, since I'm going to trace this multiple times, is I'm going to try to fix my letters. So I'm going to start dropping my threshold. And if I bring it down a little bit at a time, do you see what happens to the gradient images or the bottom of the letters? They eventually flatten out. So I didn't actually have to use nodes. It took a long time for me to do it and to learn it. But right now, my letters are all square, and I have most of my layers traced. So I'm going to keep this one. I'm going to take it and I'm going to move it up. I have all of my layers here, except you may have noticed that as I was dropping the threshold, I lost my orange layer and it highlighted the gray layer here. What I need now is to get that orange layer. So I'm going to come back to my image and I'm going to trace it a second time. And you'll see here that when I was at 128, I had the orange layer. Just to bring you back, when I dropped this down, the orange layer disappeared and it highlighted the gray. So I'm going to put this back up to around 128 where it was. You'll see I have an orange layer. My letters are askew, but it appears I have everything else I need. So I'm going to take my orange layer. Let me just hide the image for a minute. I'm going to come in, highlight my trace, ungroup it, and all I want is this orange layer right now. And I'm going to drop it into place. So I now have all of my large oval layers. It looks like I've got my letter and I've got a background layer. My wood splitter has what appears to be all three layers underneath it that I'm going to require. But what is missing, the cutout for the blue layer underneath these silver letters. So I'm going to trace it again. I'm going to come up here to the right. I'm going to show the image. And I'm going to trace it again. Now I need to start playing until I get this layer that you can see just ever so lightly around each of these letters. And I believe there it is. I just needed to change the cutoff, and now I've got that layer that I required. I'm going to keep that. I'm going to move it away. We're getting a little busy on screen here, so I'm going to get rid of the image, get that out of there. And I'm going to grab the bottom here because I no longer need this. I'm going to delete it. And now all I'm looking for here is that layer that's going to be my blue. So let's highlight, ungroup. And now what I need to do is I need to grab the outside layer on each of these letters. Now that I have everything highlighted, I'm going to group that. Now that it's grouped, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to add it in to my main template. There you have it. I'm going to grab everything here and I'm going to group it. And let's get rid of the rest. So before I go any further with the build, I want to make sure that I've captured all of the different layers and pieces out of that logo, which I have now. I've grouped it, and I'm going to save this file as file 1. And you're going to find as I go through the build, as I've learned to do over the last few months, as I progress through a build or cuts and engraves, as I get at certain points throughout the build, I'll resave the file each time. So the first file is always file 1. That's my base file. As I go forward, I'll create a file 2, file 3, file 4 as the build progresses. That way, if I ever run into any trouble, I always know file 1 was my base that I began with, and I know that each file saved along the way is saved with successful changes. So just a quick summary before we go to the next step. Nodes were always a little scary for me. They're actually not that scary. If you watch the video that I put in the description, I think you're going to get a much better understanding of it, and you're going to want to give it a shot. And I think you should, because gradient colors are kind of common. And this helps out a lot in the event that you're not able to manage that trace or manage it out of the trace. Second point, you can trace as many times as you want. Super important not to change the size of the logos or the design during your numerous traces. You've got to leave it the same size. Grab the pieces you need out. If you have time, or I'd recommend that you watch that video that I put a link in the description on how to use the trace command that describes all of the different features and how cutoff and threshold work together. Super important and very helpful, I think. Let's move on. And of course, if you're not sure if you've captured everything, highlight it and come up here to the top and press preview. And that should give you a good last look to make sure you've got everything out of that logo that you needed and you haven't missed anything. We'll press OK. I've saved it to what I call file 1. I now know going forward this is my base file. Okay, my image is still here, but I probably don't need it anymore, so I'm going to get rid of it. Might be a good idea to keep it, but in my case, I think I'm safe. So now I have my entire logo, all of my layers, but I've noticed one thing. Let me just pull up the logo in case you missed it. You'll notice here that the E on the beginning and the end are actually what I call floating characters. In other words, they're not anchored to anything. They're just hanging out there in space. You'll see that they're very close, but they're actually not touching, which means if I create this logo and I build it, I'm going to end up with these characters floating out there with nothing to anchor them to. So now I had to learn a little bit more about the Boolean weld function. And here's a few things I've learned in case you haven't used it much, because I haven't used it at all until this logo. First thing I want to do is get it as big as I can on the screen so I can see it better, my old eyes. And let's assume we'll start with this one here. What I want to do is ungroup again, and I want to grab and ungroup until all I'm grabbing is this letter. And now before I move the letter in order to weld it to the A, I need to highlight everything in there to make sure I get everything when I move it. So now I'm just going to shift and I'm going to highlight. Well, let's ungroup that. Let's try it again. I'm going to grab it. I'm going to grab it and grab it. Now I'm going to group the entire E and its components together. So now the E as a whole can move. Because if all I do is grab the back and move it to weld it, the rest of the letter E is going to be out of place. Before I move this letter though, I got to make sure that I don't bump it up or down. I need to maintain this plane across these letters. A few versions ago, Lightburn introduced, I think, what they call alignment grids, and they come from the side. If you come to the side of your workspace and you'll see your cursor changes, you can bring out lines, and you can bring out as many as you want. If you come up to the top, the same thing happens. So what I'm going to do is use the line here at the top, and I want to maintain the positioning of that word. I'm going to delete the other one. I don't need it. Now that I have an alignment, I'm going to highlight this letter, and I'm going to move it over just enough to overlap the outside and no more. I just need it to touch. And then I just need to get it lined. You'll notice I just can't get it to line up properly. And that's because the snap to grid is probably defaulted in your settings in Lightburn. So if you come up here to the gear wheel and click on it, come down under displays and units, you'll see it says snap to grid. Turn that off momentarily. It's usually very helpful, except in situations like this. Say OK, and now I should be able to properly line this up to exactly where I want it. You'll notice that I very, very gently cross both of these lines because I don't want to pull these letters too close together. In other words, I don't want visually for the E to look like it's too close to the A. So all I want to do is overlap these two outside lines. And if you come here to the left-hand side, you'll see your Boolean functions, and the first one is the weld. If I leave my cursor there, it'll explain what that function does. But watch what happens when I try to weld these two characters together. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to grab this line, and I'm going to try to weld it. And there you have it. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other end of the letter. When I'm done, I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to snap to grid again because usually that's a very helpful feature. So hey, I know it's been a long video. I've got one more big thing to show you that I've learned and a couple of small follow-ups. If it's been of value so far, hang in there with me. I'll get through this as quick as I can. So being new to Lightburn and lasers, I kind of fell into a false sense of security. Most of the videos you watch, people are doing very simple projects, and you kind of learn that if you want a fill layer, you color it black. If you want a cut layer, you color it red. But if you come down to the bottom of your Lightburn screen, you'll notice that you have 29 different layer colors and 2 toolbar layers, or tool layers as they call them. When you've got 7 different colors and multiple layers on different parts of your design, you don't have to stick to black and red. And that was a big error I made, is I kept trying to go back and forth, grouping and ungrouping different parts using only black and red. I think would have made this much more efficient and a lot easier for my old eyes to see on the screen is if I actually utilized a whole bunch of these different colored layers. But I didn't. But we're going to do that right now. We know that we have a background black layer. So let me grab my logo and let me ungroup it. There's my black layer. I take a look around. That's the outline or the background, or in essence the foundation of my sign. I'm going to leave that as black because it's black. I'm going to grab another piece of this. I know this one is gray, and if I take a look around, you'll see that it's part of the background oval shape. And I'm going to find gray, a dark gray. So I'm going to use number 16 down here at the bottom, and I'm going to assign it a gray layer. So let me grab this top layer, and I'm going to come down to layer number 5, which is orange, and I'm going to color it orange. I know that for wood splitters, the letters themselves are in fact blue. So what I want to do is come up here, and I'm going to grab the inside letter. I'm going to highlight them all. I'm going to group them together. So I'm going to come up top. I'm going to group all that together because as far as I can see at this point, they're never going to be separated. And I can come down to the bottom and I'm going to make that a blue layer. And I'm going to do the same thing for each of the components or layers of this entire sign until I'm done. I'll be right back. So now what I've done is I've gone through and I've identified and grouped each layer separately as its own layer. In essence, each color. And I've color coded them as close as I can just for reference. And if you take a look at my cuts and layers, I've got a lot of colors in there. And quite honestly, I've never had so many layers until this job. The key, which I think was a bit of a barrier for me at first, just because of what I've watched on YouTube, is that a black layer is not necessarily a fill layer. I can make a black layer anything I want, a line, a fill, or an offset fill. A red layer is not necessarily only a cut layer. You can assign whatever you want to those layers and you can change them throughout the project. But now what I have is I have the opportunity where I can make sure that I've captured everything I need to in each layer. Let's just take, for example, my wood splitters. These are going to be letters that I plan on cutting out. I've assigned them a blue layer. If I press and hold the shift key down and I come up to my cuts and layers and I click on the number 100 here, 01, it'll automatically highlight everything that I've grouped together on that layer. Currently it happens to be a line, but I can change it to a fill if I want. More importantly, I can come up here to the top and I can click on my preview window to make sure that I've captured everything I need to in that layer. And in this case, I did. It is a cut layer because I plan on cutting out those letters. But as a second example, I know that the white layer underneath it needs to be cut out, and I've assigned that a pink layer. So if I hold down my shift and I come over here to the right and I click on the pink layer, number 24, and I come up to preview, now it's showing me what the cut's going to look like on that white layer. That makes sense. I now know for sure before I fire up the laser that each layer has been correctly assigned and that I've grouped all of the components I need to. Similarly, just one last example, I'm going to hold down shift, I'm going to press the orange layer. And this should be the oval in the cutout for the middle of this sign. Come up to preview, and there it is. So now I know for sure that I've captured what I need to on every layer. Every layer is correct. If it's not, I can go back, regroup, or add different elements to the sign. And once I know that all these layers are ready, as I go through the build or the cut and the engrave on the bolt, I can assign a fill or a line to each one of these layers as needed. And that was one of the big mistakes I made, which caused me to take so long to do this sign. Because these old eyes were just getting pretty confused with all of those different black layer lines in Lightburn. And it was difficult for me to try to disassociate one from another, which is why I had to recut two different pieces and why it took me so many more hours than it needed to. The last feature in Lightburn I wanted to share with you before I do a wrap up is that if looking at all these different layers in a line format is difficult to discern one from the other, as it is for me, if you come up here to the old gear wheel again, click on it, and come down here under display graphics, you'll see something called filled rendering. If you click on that and press OK, you'll see that the display in Lightburn gives you a filled in image. So if you have fill layers, you'll see it colored in. And if you have cut layers or line layers, you'll see them as lines. And that might be a little easier for your eyes as it was for mine. Thanks for hanging in there. Let me wrap up the last few things I've learned. This was the sign. And as I mentioned, there were 4 major mistakes on this sign. One was that I still used too much weld or cement when I'm putting my pieces together. And although you may or may not be able to see it, you probably can't. If you come up really close to the sign, I can see the odd spot where the glue squished out, or when I'm using weld on, I may have dripped it. The third mistake I made was in the planning. The D and the A were supposed to have white infills, and this O and this A were supposed to have orange infills. Unfortunately, when I placed out my pieces and I was doing the final glue, I wasn't paying attention and I reversed them. So now I've got orange and then I've got white at the end. Sticks out like a sore thumb to me. I'm pretty sure my buddy will know now because I just put it in a video, but big mistake, and that right there in and of itself makes this sign unsaleable. I'd have to redo it again. The last mistake I made was with the word splitters. This is all one piece, if you remember from the build. I purposely decided I would try to freehand putting in some of these components. As you folks know, over the last couple of months, as I've done more and more signs, I will always engrave the letter or the design in the layer below so that it has a pocket to fit in when I put the sign together. That means that every single component on your design will fit and be placed exactly where it needs to be because it has an engrave underneath it to lock it in. It also allows it to lock in so it doesn't move when your cement or your weld on is curing for the next 2 or 3 days. What I did here with the wood splitters is I did use a ruler, and I also used my grid sheet to make sure that it was perfectly parallel with the Easton made word, and they were. But then I put the weight on top of them to allow the cement to cure overnight. And whether it was when I was applying the weight or the objects on top, or in the case if it had been a larger sign, I would have used some of my wood clamps, somehow the word splitter slightly altered or fell. So if I were to measure this now and put a straight line across it, the word splitter, although you may not be able to see it, has fallen and is slightly askew. It's by a hair. It's not much, but I can see it. That's to answer the question that a few of you have asked as to why I engrave the underlying layer with the next layer on top of it. Because that ensures that will never happen. It will always fit in exactly where it goes every time, exactly where it's supposed to go. For me, that's the preferred method so far. I think I'm going to wrap it up there because I've given you folks a lot of information. I appreciate it if you stuck around, and I hope it's been to some degree helpful for any new laser owners like myself. Have a great week. Please be kind to one another, and I'll see you again right here. I'm Gord Potter, and you've been watching LaserNug. Cheers.